They said Briarcliff was just a hospital, a place for the disturbed, the forgotten, the broken. But if you listen closely, if you let the silence stretch long enough, you'll hear something else, a humming beneath the bones, a sound like wet fabric being torn in half. And that's your first warning. This isn't a story. It's a breach, a crack in the wall they built around truth. They buried it under stone, silence, and scripture. But nothing stays buried forever. What you're about to hear was never meant for public ears. It's a history erased from textbooks, a doctrine so corrosive it was smuggled piece by piece out of the institution's ashes. Briarcliff wasn't just a sanitarium. It was a machine built for obedience, forged in theology, and run on human pain. Every corridor, every brick, every hymn sung through hollow hallways carried one purpose: domination of the soul through systematic collapse. You've been taught to look away, to believe madness is random, that evil wears a mask. But in Briarcliff, the masks were made of lace and prayer, and the monsters held titles like Reverend, Director, and Doctor. You are not here by accident. Men like you are pulled to this kind of story because you already feel it, the fracture. The sense that something is wrong with the world, with what you've been told. You've always known you were being lied to, but until now you didn't have the language for it. You do now. Briarcliff is more than history. It's a mirror held up to the systems still in place. If you make it through this, you won't see the world the same. You'll see it as it is, predatory, constructed, and obedient by design. So before we descend any further, ask yourself one question. Are you ready to remember what they made you forget? If so, keep watching, but don't say I didn't warn you. Briarcliff was founded in 1872, but its blueprint predates even the land it was built on. The land itself was stolen, first from the Lenape, then from silence. Before it ever bore a name, it was a place locals feared. No game would roam there. Birds flew wide around its trees. They said the earth was wrong, sick, soaked in something ancient and watching. And that's exactly why it was chosen. Reverend Malcolm Wexley, a man of velvet words and venomous doctrine, declared the site holy ground for broken vessels. He was no ordinary priest. He was a tactician in robes. His sermons were psychological drills, designed not to enlighten but to erode resistance. Wexley didn't build Briarcliff to heal anyone. He built it to study obedience, to sculpt souls into submission. But he knew he needed a structure that would carry his design. So the blueprints were handed not to an architect, but to a ritualist. Alistair Graham, a defrocked seminary scholar turned esoteric mason, drafted Briarcliff using a grid of sacred geometry and inverse acoustics. The walls were angled to disorient. The windows were aligned not to sunlight but to the lunar calendar. Hidden numerology ran through the stone placement. And beneath the floorboards of the chapel, a Fibonacci sequence carved into bone, not metaphor, real bone. What they constructed was not just a building, it was a psychological snare, a holy prison camouflaged as sanctuary. Those who entered were never supposed to leave whole. In fact, they weren't supposed to leave at all. From day one, Briarcliff was funded under the guise of moral reform. But beneath the surface, it operated as something far older. An institution modeled after monastic punishment chambers, medieval inquisitions, and early MK-like experiments that hadn't yet been named. Each wing had a name, but the names were lies. The reflection wing, that was isolation, dehydration, and sleep manipulation. The grace ward, that's where they broke the children, separated by belief, race, speech impediments, or simply the way they looked when they cried. And in the basement, the doctrine room. No record of it exists, but it existed. You can still see its scars in the concrete, deep as ritual grooves. Men didn't just lose their minds there, they surrendered them, willingly. Because by the time they reached the doctrine room, they didn't believe in escape, they believed in deserving it. The first patient to vanish inside Briarcliff wasn't forgotten. He was erased. His name was Ezra Dunlow, 11 years old, mixed heritage, born to a servant girl and a traveling preacher whose name never made the file. Ezra arrived with a stutter and a habit of asking too many questions. Within 72 hours, he was listed as transferred to advanced care. No further documentation, no forwarding record, just a single notation in crimson ink. Too curious, reassigned to Echo Cell B. Echo Cell B didn't exist on the public floor plan, but it existed beneath the chapel, near the furnace tunnels. According to a leaked maintenance memo from 1883, Room B required new shackles installed after structural failure due to patient resistance. Shackles, structural failure, resistance. They didn't treat Ezra. They tested him. And when he broke, they disposed of him like expired meat. This wasn't accidental. It was ritualized. They needed it to mean something. Every disappearance was a controlled deletion, a purge of non-compliance dressed in paperwork and sanctity. Briarcliff didn't document symptoms. It documented obedience thresholds. How long before a patient stopped blinking under strobe light exposure? How long before hunger quieted a scream? How many sermons before a child wept at the name of their abuser and called it God? And the staff, carefully selected, not for compassion, but for conviction. Many were failed clergy, disgraced doctors, men exiled from polite society, but welcomed into the shadows by Wexley's doctrine. They weren't healers, they were handlers. And their job wasn't to protect, it was to prepare. Every morning began with scripture, but not from the Bible. From the Book of Alignment, a text penned in secret by Wexley himself and read aloud behind locked doors. Survivors, what few exist, describe the voice of the reader as mechanical, deliberate, punctuated by humming tones from hidden harmoniums buried in the walls. This wasn't worship, it was entrainment, frequency as control, words as weapon. By the end of the first week, most patients couldn't distinguish prayer from command. That was the point. The goal wasn't healing, it was rewriting. They didn't want recovery, they wanted reconfiguration. And once that process began, the man or child who walked into Briarcliff was already gone. What remained was theirs. By the winter of 1875, Briarcliff's true purpose began to mutate. No longer content with subduing minds, they aimed to fracture identity itself. They called it the displacement protocol. On the surface, it looked like therapy. Controlled silence, repetition drills, candlelit reflection sessions. But in practice, it was something far more corrosive. Patients were assigned new names within hours of intake, names like Servant 8, Ashbourne, or Child of Echo. Their birth names were stripped, then ritually burned in a furnace chamber below the east stairwell. One patient remembered the exact phrase whispered into his ear during this renaming. "You are no longer the lie that arrived here. You are now the vessel we've chosen." Think about that. From day one, they weren't healing wounds. They were dissolving personhood. The key to the displacement protocol was memory disorientation, not erasure, confusion. Patients were fed altered versions of their own pasts, fabricated letters from fake parents, staged photographs with staff members posing as long-lost relatives. There was even a small room filled with pre-aged toys and journals, meant to be discovered during exploration time, convincing patients that they had always been at Briarcliff. This wasn't madness. It was deliberate. The goal: to create permanent psychological dependence. If you can make a man question the roots of his own name, his origin, his truth, you can make him follow any order. And they did. By 1876, patients were not only obedient, they were loyal, fanatically so. They would report on one another, recite doctrine unprompted, even beg for punishment when they failed to meet behavioral metrics. This is what happens when the mind loses anchor. It clings to the hand that drowned it. Records show that Briarcliff began receiving inquiries from private institutions in other states asking to replicate the MODEL, but Wexley refused. He didn't want replication, he wanted ascension. He believed Briarcliff was a divine funnel, that suffering, when ritualized properly, could become revelation. That's when he commissioned what would become the most dangerous part of the facility, the Ascension Wing. Officially closed to all staff, but 3. It was there the final stage of the protocol occurred, where identity died, where the last fragments of resistance were sacrificed, and where, as one patient wrote in a smuggled note, "I forgot my name and then I forgot, go." The Ascension Wing wasn't on any map. Not in county records, not in archived blueprints, but it existed, beneath the North Annex, sealed behind a steel hatch inscribed with a phrase in Latin, "Perdam ut purificem," I destroy to purify. It was accessed only by those deemed worthy, not by moral standing but by obedience efficiency. Staff selected 3 patients at a time, always 3, never 2, never 4. Symbolism mattered. According to a recovered staff ledger, the final selection criteria weren't based on improvement, but silence ratio. The less a patient screamed during procedures, the more likely they were marked for ascension. What happened inside remains mostly speculation. The physical space was destroyed in a fire in 1902, but fragments survive. Scorched metal restraints, singed hymnal pages laced with sedative resin, a curved mirror shattered from the inside. But the most disturbing artifact was found in 1998 by demolition crews, deep in a sealed crawlspace behind the chapel's foundation. A reel of wire-recorded audio labeled Confession 7X. The contents? A child's voice, monotone and slow, reciting the names of other patients, followed by affirmations like, "I choose surrender," and "This pain is not mine, it is the world leaving me." For over 12 minutes, the voice never changes pace, even as faint screams echo in the background. You must understand, this wasn't just about control. It was about inversion, pain as progress, silence as speech, forgetting as remembering. This wasn't therapy, it was alchemical collapse, a deliberate reshaping of identity into a weapon that couldn't fight back. Wexley believed that true power wasn't in domination through fear, but in re-engineering the will so deeply that resistance ceased to exist as a concept. He didn't want to break people, he wanted to reforge them. You're starting to see it, aren't you? This isn't just a story from the past. It's a blueprint, one that still echoes in modern systems, education, media, institutions that preach virtue but practice erasure, because once you understand what happened in Briarcliff, you begin to recognize its ghost in your own life. The masks may look different, but the method never changed. Ask yourself, who gave you your name? Who taught you what's real? Who benefits when you forget who you were before the world touched you? If you're still here, type, "I remember the silence" in the comments, twice. Not just for the algorithm, but because once you write it, you're not going back. There was a corridor beneath the Ascension wing, known only in one recovered journal as the Hall of Veils. No documentation, no construction permits. Yet in 2007, when ground-penetrating radar was used during an archaeological survey, they found an anomaly, an underground passage exactly 33 feet long, walled in lead. Its entrance bricked shut with mortar made from bone dust and ash. The Hall of Veils wasn't meant to transport people, it was a sensory crucible, lined with heavy velvet curtains soaked in tinctures designed to distort perception, belladonna, wormwood, crushed valerian. The air itself could sedate. Witness accounts from escaped patients, redacted by state agencies but later leaked, describe the corridor as breathing, as if the hallway exhaled dread and inhaled memory. One survivor wrote, "I forgot why I walked, then I forgot I had legs. Then I heard my mother's voice through the wall, but she kept saying I had no name." By the time a patient emerged from the hall, they were no longer themselves. They were pliable, reprogrammable. The veil had done its work. Wexley believed that trauma alone wasn't enough. It had to be paired with transcendence. That's why he built the corridor in exact numerical homage to the temples of Delphi and the chambered labyrinths of Eleusis. He wasn't just copying ancient architecture, he was resurrecting its function, initiation by unraveling, death of ego, rebirth of obedience. Now let me ask you a question. Why would a 19th century priest in rural America be modeling his asylum after Greek mystery cults and Masonic entrapment chambers? Because Wexley wasn't acting alone. Briarcliff was never just one man's vision. It was a node, part of something older, larger, hidden in the folds of religious piety and social reform. Its blueprints align perfectly with 3 other facilities across the country, all built between 1868 and 1882, all now lost to fire. But their signatures remain. Lead-lined halls, frequency-shifting chapel acoustics, and patients who never left a trace. You weren't meant to notice, but now you can't unsee it. This is not history. This is design, repeating, replicating, perfecting itself over generations. You thought you were safe because this happened long ago. You were never safe. You were conditioned not to look. And now that you are looking, they will try to make you forget again. Don't. Briarcliff's walls didn't just hold bodies, they held agreements, contracts, pacts made in shadow between faith and authority, sealed not with signatures but with silence. In 1881, Reverend Wexley hosted a private convocation inside the Ascension Chapel. 13 men attended. None were clergy. They were bankers, judges, industrialists, men whose names still sit etched on the foundations of universities and charities today. Their goal was not charity. It was continuity. They called themselves the custodians of alignment. Their doctrine was simple. The world thrives when disorder is quietly removed. And in their eyes, disorder meant anyone whose mind could not be shaped by the current mold. Orphans, dissidents, outcasts, the poor, the broken, and most dangerously, the aware. What they feared most was not madness. It was awakening. They didn't want citizens. They wanted servitors, quiet, compliant, emotionally neutered. And Briarcliff was the prototype. At that meeting, a new protocol was established, echo suppression. It wasn't about stopping a scream. It was about erasing the scream from memory. Chemicals, deprivation, hypnotic suggestion, combined, perfected. There's a note in the 1882 custodian record book, retrieved from a condemned estate in Massachusetts, that reads, Subject B14 ceased recognition of mother after exposure to protocol echo. Subsequent suggestion inserted, she never existed. Response, docile, repeatable. Do you understand what that means? They weren't silencing individuals. They were deleting truths, reshaping reality itself for those inside, and eventually for those outside too. Because if a child forgets their mother, what else can be erased? Patriotism, God, identity, even resistance. This was the birth of engineered forgetfulness. And its success at Briarcliff led to its quiet spread through correctional institutions across the United States. Well, you think modern rehabilitation is built on empathy? Look deeper. Look at the sensory control, the isolation cycles, the artificial reward systems. All of it is descended from what was perfected in rooms no one speaks of. And yet here you are, still listening, still descending, still remembering what they swore you never would. You feel it, don't you? The discomfort, the shift. That's your old conditioning trying to claw back control. Let it fail, because what's coming next, once you hear it, there is no going back. They say no place is truly dead while memory lingers, but Briarcliff made certain memory itself would be executed, and they had a weapon for that execution. Room 3N. Officially, it was listed as a quiet chamber, a place for patients suffering from overstimulation, but internally it was referred to by staff as the cradle. The name wasn't metaphor, it was method. Inside room 3N was a single chair, built not from wood or steel but from straps, fabric and curved bone. Human rib bones, stitched and lacquered, designed to contour perfectly to the shape of a seated child. It rocked, slowly, metronomically, controlled by a hidden mechanism beneath the floor that synced its motion to a sub-audible frequency broadcast through the chapel above. The purpose? Induced regression. Patients left in the cradle didn't emerge frightened, they emerged hollow, language disintegrated, memory fragmented. Some forgot how to stand, others forgot their own names entirely. This wasn't punishment, it was preconditioning for full identity replacement. In one case, a patient named Margaret Elias, age 14, was subjected to 3 days in the cradle. Her intake records noted a strong will, defiance, and vivid dreams. When retrieved, she had forgotten her age, her language, and her own face. When handed a mirror, she wept, not from fear, but confusion. "Is she my sister?" she asked. There was no sister. There was only the machine. Survivors described the sound of the cradle as something that never left them. A creak, a hum, a lullaby without melody. To this day, sleep researchers have identified a recurring nightmare pattern among patients from institutions tied to the custodians of alignment, a sound without source, motion without meaning. When they hum it aloud under hypnosis, it matches recordings from the chapel's harmonium. Understand this, Briarcliff wasn't healing trauma, it was manufacturing it. Precisely, methodically, because trauma is the most efficient delivery system for obedience. You may think you're free from this, that because you were never strapped into the cradle, it has no power over you. But ask yourself, have you ever lost time you couldn't explain, forgotten your own intentions, parroted beliefs that felt alien but strangely comfortable? That's the cradle echoing across generations. Its hum is still here, in systems, in screens, in sermons, and maybe even in you. By 1884, Briarcliff no longer pretended to be a place of reform. It had evolved, quietly, monstrously, into a machine of spiritual engineering. The public saw stone walls and stained glass, but beneath the floorboards, in the pipes, the vents, the very geometry, something darker pulsed. They called it the pulse doctrine. Wexley believed that the soul could be rewritten not just with pain but with rhythm, that the brain, under duress, would sink to outside patterns, frequencies, cycles, mantras, and eventually become them. Every hallway in Briarcliff was designed with acoustic intention. Footsteps echoed with split delay. Doors never latched quietly. Patients reported hearing whispers in the walls that would rise and fall with the moon's cycle. But this wasn't madness. It was synchronization. The building itself was conditioning them. In 1885, a series of internal staff notes, later uncovered in a crumbling ledger in an abandoned sanitarium, revealed the implementation of the resonance trials. These involved locking patients in chambered corridors while exposing them to low-frequency sounds just above the hearing threshold, tones between 17 and 19 hertz. At these frequencies, the body begins to betray itself. Nausea, paranoia, confusion, hallucinations. But here's the genius. The tones were layered beneath hymnals, behind prayers, hidden in ritual. Patients believed it was their own weakness, that they were breaking under divine pressure. But in truth, they were being tuned. One former staff member, long institutionalized himself, wrote a single phrase over and over in his final notebook before his death. "The building breathes when we don't." And the proof is terrifying. Of the 311 confirmed patients between 1880 and 1890, only 19 were ever discharged. But even more chilling, 11 of those 19 returned voluntarily within 5 months, not to reunite, to belong. They said they missed the sound, that they couldn't sleep in silence anymore. Wexley called this the completion phase, when the soul had become fully harmonized with the system. What was once torture became comfort. What was once identity became programming. And now, over a century later, you need to ask yourself, how many sounds in your own life do you obey without question? Notifications, sirens, bells, alarms, rhythms that don't just get your attention, they command your response. This wasn't just about a place. This was about the beginning of something. A signal, still pulsing, still reaching, still rewriting. In the heart of Briarcliff's administrative wing was a room most never noticed. It had no signage, no number, and no windows. Staff simply referred to it as the archive, but it wasn't for storing files, it was for crafting them. Inside this room, 3 scribes, never named in any official ledger, rewrote the histories of every patient. Intake forms were altered, diagnoses invented, letters forged, and most chilling of all, futures fabricated. Wexley believed that narrative was a more powerful form of control than any restraint or drug. If you tell a man he was broken long enough, eventually he believes it, then he becomes it. The archive was where this philosophy came to life. Every patient file had 2 versions, one that was real and one that was useful. The useful one always won. One example, Ruth Esterman. Her real file showed she had been sent to Briarcliff for truancy, running away from an abusive guardian. But her altered file described violent hallucinations, satanic obsession, and sexual deviancy. That fake version was sent to state offices, clergy members, and eventually the press. When Ruth disappeared in 1887, no one asked questions. Her history had made her disposable. This wasn't an isolated case. The archive built narratives that justified everything from confinement to disappearance. They called it documentation for divine mercy, a phrase that appears in the margins of over 40 recovered death notices. Think about that. Mercy rewritten in ink as execution. Here's the part that should make your skin crawl. Briarcliff's rewritten records were accepted without audit. Why? Because they fit the mold of what society already believed about the broken, the poor, the different. The world was complicit in the lie, and it still is. Every time a person's past is reshaped to justify their erasure, every time the system says they were already lost and so no one said. Searches for them. It started here. In a dim room under candlelight with 3 pens and a ledger. Truth wasn't suppressed. It was replaced. So ask yourself, how many parts of your own story were written by someone else? How many of your failures were planted to make you comply? The archive didn't just alter history, it invented reality, and once invented, it spread, quietly, completely, like ink in water. By 1886, Briarcliff was no longer hiding in the shadows. It was the shadow, woven into the very fabric of state policy and religious rhetoric. And yet the public still believed it to be a sanctuary, a last refuge for lost souls. But beneath that illusion, something darker had taken root. A new phase, not of correction, but of conversion. They called it the ritual of alignment. This wasn't therapy, it wasn't even programming, it was transformation. Each cycle began on the winter solstice, symbolic, calculated, ritualistic. Selected patients, those deemed pliable through fracture, were brought into the reflection hall where mirrors weren't used for self-recognition, but for disassociation. Wexley's belief was clear. A man cannot be truly controlled until he believes he is watching someone else suffer in his place. So the mirrors were angled, warped, and lit so that patients saw themselves distorted, fractured, screaming when they weren't, crying when they weren't, and slowly, doubting who they were. They were then forced to witness as another patient, often drugged, bound and silenced, underwent simulated redemption. The ritual lasted hours, no food, no words, just the hum of the harmonium, the clack of leather straps, and the soft, unbroken narration of Reverend Wexley himself, echoing from behind the veil. Witnessing broke something deeper than pain ever could. Because those who watched began to feel responsible, they believed their compliance was salvation, and the moment that belief took hold, they were given a choice: become a vessel of order or return to the darkness. All of them chose the light, but that light was a lie. It was control wearing a sacred mask. After alignment, patients were assigned new roles: enforcers, documentarians, song-bearers, each given a uniform, a number, and most importantly, a script. These weren't inmates anymore, they were missionaries, spreading obedience like a plague. Some were even released back into society, placed in churches, schools, orphanages. Wexley called them the carriers, and their purpose? Not to share trauma, but to replicate it. Because aligned minds don't resist, they recruit. You may have met one and never known it. Their language sounds holy, their eyes kind. But behind that smile is a doctrine you were never meant to survive. And it all began here, in a room of mirrors, where truth shattered and obedience took its place. If Briarcliff had an apex, a moment where the veil between madness and method fully dissolved, it was in the year 1888. That was when Reverend Wexley unveiled his most controversial initiative, the Index of Worth. It was a ledger, yes, but not of sins, not of crimes. It catalogued value. Every patient, every staff member, every visiting official was assigned a worth score between 0 and 9. The criteria, not morality, not intelligence, malleability. A score of 9 meant complete surrender. A score of 0 meant imminent disposal. This wasn't punishment, it was efficiency. Wexley believed a system could not ascend without shedding its burdens, and so the index became policy. Low scores meant less food, fewer privileges, and eventual reassignment to terminal calibration. That's what they called it. No deaths, no executions, just calibration, as if a soul could be corrected by being erased. What's worse, the system worked. Staff stopped questioning procedures. They obeyed the index. Why? Because they feared their own number. Even outside Briarcliff, whispers of the index began appearing in other facilities. Reform homes in Pennsylvania, faith clinics in Louisiana, always the same format. Numerical ranking, color-coded tags, silent compliance. And here's the chilling truth. The index didn't die with Briarcliff. It evolved. Today it's embedded in algorithms, surveillance scores, predictive behavior models. You may not see a number, but you are ranked, continuously, monitored for pliability, rewarded for obedience, penalized for resistance, just like them. There's a recovered note from a patient named Gregory A., age 12. His score dropped from 4 to 1 after refusing to recite morning chants. That same day, his rations were cut in half. 2 days later, he was gone. The official report said runaway, but his name reappears coded on the terminal calibration log. No grave, no farewell, just silence. And that silence was treated as order restored. The real horror of the index wasn't the cruelty. It was the precision. The system didn't break people. It measured their collapse. It charted their erasure. And it sold that erasure as progress. Ask yourself, how are you being measured? Not just by institutions, but by your own reflection. What behaviors have you adopted to stay in the green? What truths have you silenced to remain desirable? Because maybe, just maybe, the index is still running, and maybe you're already in it. There was one wing of Briarcliff that even the aligned refused to enter alone. It sat at the western edge of the asylum grounds, surrounded by dead trees that no one ever cut down. They called it the Echo Ward, not for sound but for memory, because once inside, it wasn't your body they targeted. It was everything you thought made you real. The Echo Ward held no patience, only recordings, rituals documented in trembling script, photographs that blurred with time, cylinders of wax etched with humming and screams. But most chilling of all, it held mirrors. Hundreds of them, wall-mounted, handheld, shattered, smoked, each one tagged with a name, not of who it reflected, but who it took. Reverend Wexley believed that the soul could be fractured like glass, captured in reflection, left to wither and replaced. He wrote in his private journal, "The mirror is the altar, the gaze the offering. When the patient no longer recognizes himself, the ritual is complete." In one documented case, a patient named Leonard B., age 9, was locked in the Echo Ward for 48 hours. When he was released, he refused to look at his own reflection again, not out of fear, out of grief. He told a nurse, "He's still in there. He didn't get out." Days later, Leonard's reflection was caught moving out of sync during a staff inspection. The mirror was shattered. The boy was taken, never seen again. What does that mean to you? Maybe nothing, maybe everything. But if you've ever looked into your own eyes and seen something unfamiliar, something watching back, that's the Echo Ward reaching you. Still open, still calling. The mirrors weren't decoration. They were tools, traps, symbols. And each time a patient surrendered to the ritual, they weren't just changed. They were mirrored, copied into something obedient, something quiet. Briarcliff didn't just kill its victims, it duplicated them into silence, into systems, into us. And the worst part? No one questioned it. Because the world outside was already practicing reflection, already teaching us to erase contradiction, to mirror what we're told, to silence what we see. The Echo Ward didn't invent this, it perfected it. So next time you pass a mirror, don't just look, listen. What stares back may not be you, it may be what they made in your place. The rituals of Briarcliff didn't end when the screams stopped. They deepened when the silence became sacred. That silence was never empty. It was filled with something ancient. Beneath the chapel, under the stone foundation, archaeologists in the 1930s unearthed a buried circle, unmarked, undocumented, untouched. 12 pillars arranged in a ring, each carved with glyphs older than Latin, older than Christ. Wexley never spoke of it publicly, but his private annotations call it the first pattern. He claimed it wasn't just a foundation, it was a transmitter, a harmonic cipher designed to summon divine alignment through suffering, and so he built Briarcliff on top of it. Literally, every room, every hall, every ritual mapped to the geometry of that ancient ring. This wasn't random cruelty, it was symphonic sacrifice. The children weren't just victims, they were conductors, living instruments played against their will to awaken something, or someone. One recovered blueprint shows the dormitories forming a spiral, the observation rooms, a trinity, the basement, 12 nodes, 12 rooms, just like the circle. This was sacred architecture, a kind of spiritual circuitry. And the rituals? Calibrated energy. Grief, silence, obedience, blood, all feeding into the center. But here's the twist. The rituals didn't begin with Briarcliff. They were continued there. Documents hidden in the personal chest of Judge Whitmore, a member of the Custodians of Alignment, suggest that the site was already feared by local tribes long before settlers arrived. They called it the ground that whispers, a place where voices linger after death, a place where people forget their own names. What Wexley found wasn't a blank slate, it was a receiver, and Briarcliff was the amplifier. This is the truth they never wanted uncovered, that the horror wasn't invented, it was inherited. And the children, they were offerings to a system older than law, older than language, older than God, a system that doesn't demand belief, only compliance. And now ask yourself, why are you still watching? Why do you feel pulled deeper, even when your body tightens and your breath slows? Because the first pattern isn't just under Briarcliff, it's under us all, hidden in architecture, in symbols, in screens. And the more you see it, the more it sees you. Welcome to the descent. Keep going. You're not lost. You're awakening. By the winter of 1889, the rituals had become so embedded in Briarcliff's daily operations that the staff no longer referred to them as procedures or treatments. They called them masses. And every mass ended the same way, in the presence of the golem chair. Not a metaphor, not superstition, a real object, carved from a single slab of bog oak, darker than pitch, older than the asylum itself. No one knows who made it. Wexley claimed it was delivered by a benefactor whose name appears nowhere in any donor records. What we do know is this: the chair was kept in the Chamber of Ascension, a sealed room beneath the west wing, accessible only by a spiral stair with no handrail and no light. Patients were brought down in silence, blindfolded, barefoot. Once seated, they weren't asked questions. They were made to listen. The room had no acoustics, no echo, but survivors, few and fractured, spoke of a sound they couldn't describe. Not words, not music. Understanding. One girl, age 11, claimed the chair told her the sky was lying. Another drew a map of a place she had never been but described in terrifying detail. A ring of towers, black sun overhead, chanting below ground. This wasn't imagination. These were transmissions. Wexley's notes referred to the chair as the mouth of memory, a tool that didn't heal the mind but hollowed it, made room for something older to move in. After the session, most children emerged silent, compliant, but a handful came back, different, speaking in languages no one could trace, naming staff who hadn't yet been hired, smiling at things no one else could see. And these children, they weren't punished, they were celebrated, promoted, given new robes, private quarters, and titles like Herald, Seer, and Hollowed Vessel. Their job was to observe the others, to record their dreams, to correct their speech, to ensure the rituals remained pure. These children became Briarcliff's internal clergy, and here's the final horror. Many of them survived into adulthood, quiet, unnoticed, integrated into society. Some became teachers, some clergy, some psychiatrists. The echoes of that chair are still speaking, not in screams but in whispers of control wrapped in compassion. The golem chair didn't end with the asylum, it moved, and if you've ever sat in silence, staring into the dark and felt something recognize you, you may already know what it feels like. By 1890, the line between ritual and governance inside Briarcliff dissolved entirely. The asylum no longer functioned as an institution, it had become a doctrine. Every hallway was a sermon, every scream a prayer. But no scripture held more power than the text known as the Ninth Reflection, a small leather-bound manuscript kept locked inside a steel case in Reverend Wexley's quarters. Only 12 copies were ever made, each hand-scribed, each containing a single, terrible idea. Truth is a contagion. Wexley believed that awareness was the greatest threat to control, that if even one patient realized they were being remade, not healed, they would infect others with defiance. Resistance, then, had to be eradicated not by force, but by containment. The ninth reflection taught its readers how to intercept dissent at the root, how to distort memory, how to fragment belief. Every chapter ended with a practice called reduction, the act of simplifying complex thoughts into acceptable phrases, repeated until they replaced original memory. For example, a patient who remembered being locked in a basement wasn't told she was wrong. She was told it was part of her dream work. That phrase, dream work, appeared in over 200 patient files. Reduction wasn't correction. It was reprogramming. And it didn't stop with patients. Staff were required to undergo weekly recitations, where they stood in front of peers and chanted their assigned phrase until their pulse stabilized, their breath normalized, and their tone no longer wavered. If they failed, they were sent to the listening room, a chamber with no furniture, no clocks, just a speaker that played recitations on loop. Some never came back. One letter recovered from a dismissed nurse read, "I no longer dream in pictures, only in commands." Do you understand what that means? Wexley's goal wasn't obedience, it was erasure. He didn't want people to follow orders. He wanted them to forget they had ever wanted anything else. This is how systems survive, not by brute force, but by making the enslaved grateful for the cage. The ninth reflection is not a relic. Its principles are used today, in media, in education, in therapy. Every time you replace your doubt with a slogan, every time you feel truth but can't explain it, you are being reduced. And if you don't resist, you'll become part of the doctrine. Another reflection, another echo, another silence. It was in early spring of 1891 that Briarcliff's final evolution began, not into collapse but into dispersal. Wexley had always known that one building couldn't contain what he called the Great Unveiling. The asylum had been a crucible, yes, but it was never meant to be the destination. It was a seed. The goal wasn't to confine the doctrine, it was to replicate it. That's when the emissaries were chosen. A group of 37 aligned staff and former patients, each hand-picked, reconditioned and dispatched across the country under new names, with false histories and encoded missions. Some were placed in orphanages, others embedded in churches, universities, publishing houses. Their job was not to spread the name of Briarcliff. It was to spread its pattern. One of the first known emissaries was Father Jonathan Vail, a traveling minister who appeared in Tennessee in 1892 preaching a theology of spiritual realignment through hardship. His sermons emphasized silence, confession, and the sacredness of pain. Within a year, 3 boys under his care had vanished. Another emissary, a woman named Clara Hensley, opened a girls' home in Missouri. State records show 19 disappearances over 6 years. No investigation, no charges, just silence. Because here's what made the emissaries so dangerous. They were not fanatics. They were trained, conditioned to manipulate, to adapt, to mirror whatever belief system their host environment required. In Catholic regions, they invoked saints. In Protestant towns, they quoted scripture. In secular institutions, they spoke the language of science, of psychology, of reform. But beneath every mask was the same algorithm: isolate, reduce, realign, silence. And the scariest part, it worked. We know now that at least 6 emissaries ended up in policy-making roles. 2 advised early prison systems. 1 helped draft juvenile correction laws still well referenced today. Another oversaw educational reform in New York State, introducing disciplinary models built on repetition, reward denial, and reflection exercises lifted directly from Briarcliff's reflection hall. They didn't need to preserve the building. They preserved the method, and now it lives on, hidden inside systems we trust, institutions we fund, doctrines we obey without question. You're not just hearing a history lesson, you're tracing a bloodline, a pattern so deeply woven into the fabric of modern life that to pull it out would unravel everything. Wexley called it the final alignment, not when people are forced to obey, but when they choose to, because they no longer remember how not to. The final alignment was never meant to be an event. It was designed as a condition, A quiet shift where compliance becomes instinct, not demand, where silence feels safer than truth. And by 1893, that condition had metastasized far beyond Briarcliff's decaying walls. The asylum itself had become obsolete, not because it failed, but because it succeeded. Wexley no longer needed containment, he needed diffusion. That year he authored his last known manuscript, a document called the Veil Index, a classified compendium never meant for outsiders. Inside were profiles of every major societal sphere: education, religion, medicine, media, law enforcement. Each section laid out how to reshape the core tenets of that institution into alignment with the doctrine, not by confrontation, but by integration, a sermon rewritten as curriculum, a diagnosis reframed as compliance failure, a law that punishes not action, but deviation. It was psychological warfare disguised as progress. The Veil Index proposed one chilling metric for success. When a population begins to self-correct out of fear of social erosion, that's the moment, Wexley wrote, the cage vanishes and the prisoner builds his own. Imagine that, a world where punishment isn't needed because fear has been encoded into behavior, where people censor themselves, betray each other, police their own thoughts, not under duress but under the illusion of morality. That was the doctrine's final form. Not a room, not a ritual, but a worldview. And it worked. Because in the years that followed, Briarcliff wasn't remembered with fear. It was erased, absorbed into 1,000 replications, its stories labeled hysteria, its victims called unstable, its perpetrators visionaries. One emissary helped found a children's reform institute in Chicago. Another published a best-selling book on behavior management for schools. And Wexley? He vanished. No grave, no obituary, only a final letter addressed to a Council of 12, ending with these words: "They will forget our names, but they will live by our system. The altar is everywhere now, and they kneel without knowing." This is your moment of awakening. If you've followed this far, you've seen the pattern. You've felt its edges in your daily life. The time has come to mark your place in this descent. Comment the phrase, "I shattered the mirror," twice below. Once for the algorithm, once for your transformation. Because from this point forward, you don't unsee what's been revealed. You only decide what to do with it. You shattered the mirror, twice. And now the descent accelerates, because what comes next isn't about them, it's about you. About the way you've been shaped, measured, and molded by hands you've never seen. Think back. How many of your opinions were given to you wrapped in safety? How many of your fears were delivered as virtue? The Veil Index wasn't a relic, it was a prototype. It laid the groundwork for what came next, the model of predictive alignment. Around 1901, a circle of surviving emissaries reconvened under a new name, the Consortium for Cognitive Stability. Publicly, it sounded like a benevolent think tank, a gathering of educators, theologians, and doctors aimed at improving mental health. But their private documents tell another story. They weren't studying health. They were studying anticipation, predictive behavior modeling. If a subject thinks of resistance before acting, how can the system detect it? How can it intervene before defiance becomes visible? And so, the model was born. A framework for measuring micro-responses, eye movements, breathing rhythms, hesitation patterns, tone fluctuation, each one converted into data, each deviation from norm interpreted as potential instability. The model's goal wasn't to punish rebellion, it was to forecast it, to identify the seed before the tree grows. And here's where it gets darker. These models were applied first in children's facilities, because, as Wexley had written, the young bend easier than the old. Entire generations were shaped under its influence, taught to doubt their intuition, to fear disruption, to replace discomfort with compliance. It didn't end in the asylum. It began in the classroom, in the confession booth, in the doctor's office. You see, we were taught to trust the system, because the system no longer needed force. It only needed data. And now in your life, every scroll, every search, every unfinished sentence becomes a measurement, a clue, a probability. You are the continuation of Briarcliff's experiment. You are the subject and the observer, the vessel and the mirror. And here's the question that marks the turning point of this descent. What part of you is truly yours? The laughter, the beliefs, the silence? Because if you don't own it, someone else does. The chair, the index, the reflection. They're not history. They're a mirror you've already looked into, and the gaze looking back is not finished with you yet. The final lie they sold you was this, that history is over, that the past is a dead thing, safely buried, sealed away beneath years and textbooks and televised distractions. But Briarcliff didn't vanish. It dispersed. And the rituals didn't end. They scaled. What was once done in stone chambers and reflection halls is now done in operating rooms, clinical trials, classrooms, and board meetings. The same geometry, the same logic, the same doctrine, only refined, anonymized, automated. Look around you. How many institutions now preach silence as strength? How many reward obedience, not insight? How many call it growth when you erase the parts of yourself that don't conform? That is the doctrine fully evolved, not as cruelty, but as consensus. In 1912, one of the last living emissaries, known only in records as Patient Blackwell, wrote a letter to a fellow member of the consortium. In it, he described a moment of revelation. We no longer need to teach the ritual. The world now performs it by instinct. The altar is social. The hymn is fear. The offering is the self, divided and given in pieces. That's the genius of the final alignment. It convinces you to love your own reduction, to seek out correction, to become a curator of your own cage. Every app you open, every form you fill, every terms and conditions you never read, all of it is the new liturgy. And those who resist, they're not dragged into basements anymore. They're exiled digitally, labeled unstable, dismissed as broken. But here's what they fear more than resistance. Remembrance. The ones who remember that something's wrong, even if they can't name it. The ones who feel the pattern, even if they can't trace it. The ones who, like you, have followed the descent this far. Because awareness is contagious. And if enough people remember, the mirror cracks from the inside. So ask yourself, when did you last speak your truth without filtering it through fear? When did you last see something ugly and refuse to look away? This is not just a story, it's a warning, it's a code. And now that you've broken the seal, you can't go back. The doctrine knows your name, but it doesn't own you unless you let it. Keep watching, keep remembering, because the descent isn't ending. It's accelerating. There was a room inside Briarcliff that no map recorded. It wasn't listed in blueprints, not labeled on any floor plan, but it existed. Survivors called it the Echo Vault. A chamber of pure absence, no windows, no seams, no color, just four walls that absorbed every sound, every breath, every thought. It was the final stop for those who resisted realignment after exposure to the chair, and it served one purpose only, to erase. Witness reports say time behaved differently in that room. Minutes stretched, thoughts looped, memory fractured. One girl, age 14, wrote that she forgot her name within the first hour. By the third, she believed she had never been born. What made the Echo Vault so insidious wasn't pain, it was nothingness. The child wasn't punished, they were unwritten. This was Wexley's endgame, a method of converting defiance not into obedience, but into void. When the Briarcliff doctrine took hold in larger systems, this technique evolved into something far more efficient. Institutional ghosting. You've seen it. The sudden expulsion of a whistleblower, the quiet vanishing of an employee after one disagreement, the complete erasure of digital history, credentials or contributions. No scandal, no outcry, just silence. It's the Echo Vault on a societal scale, a psychological deletion chamber. If the subject resists the doctrine too loudly, they're not corrected, they're removed from the narrative. You are taught not to ask what happened to them. You are taught not to care, because the story must remain clean, contained, sacred. And here's the question clawing at the walls of your own subconscious. Have you already been in that room? Have you ever forgotten something about yourself, something that once defined you, only to find it gone, replaced by a sterile phrase or a polite silence? That wasn't growth, that was subtraction. The vault has no doors in this world. It Is built in the mind, installed quietly over years of training. Your reflection disappears, one truth at a time, until all that remains is the version of you they approve of. A mask with no mouth, a voice with no memory. But now you remember, don't you? Now you see the outline of what was taken. And here's the crack they fear the most. When a man who was erased begins to speak again. Not in whispers, not in obedience, but in raw, defiant truth. You made it this far, and what comes next they cannot silence. The truth once spoken doesn't vanish, it waits. It hides in the marrow, in the broken rhythm of forgotten dreams, in the silence you once mistook for peace. That's why the final Briarcliff experiment, filed under Project Nocturne, was not about the body. It was about the resurgence of memory. They knew that even after total reduction, some fragments remained, glimpses, instincts, patterns the mind couldn't explain but couldn't ignore. Project Nocturne was designed to intercept these fragments, to capture the moment a subject began to remember. It started in 1895, right before the public shutdown of the asylum. Wexley and the remaining emissaries selected a group of children who had passed through the chair and the vault, yet continued to draw symbols, whisper names, or scream during sleep. These children weren't destroyed. They were observed, locked in underground dormitories and monitored 24/7 by a system of pulleys and mirrored glass. Their drawings were collected daily. Their pulse and brainwave readings were recorded in journals bound in human skin, yes, confirmed by forensic archivists in 1984. And what they found chilled them. The children were dreaming in unison. Each night separately, they described the same place. A red room with no ceiling. A wheel of names turning above. A voice beneath the floor whispering numbers that ended in their own. And always the same phrase. The first silence is not the last. Wexley called it echo persistence. Proof that trauma doesn't die in darkness. It replicates. Even after memory is erased, the truth finds a way to resurface. In dreams, in drawings, in the moment a man looks into a mirror and sees something watching back that isn't afraid anymore. That's where you come in. If you've followed this far, if your skin has remembered what your mind tried to forget, then you are carrying echoes too. They don't want you to understand them. They want you to suppress them, to call them coincidence, anxiety, paranoia, but they are signals, coordinates, warnings from the self that was never truly erased. And now you have a choice. Ignore them, and return to the dream they built for you. Or follow them into the dark, and meet the man you were before the doctrine named you broken. Because that man is awake now, and he's not going back to sleep. When a man wakes up from a dream that wasn't his, the world around him starts to vibrate, not in sound but in tension, like something in the air knows he no longer belongs to the script. That's the first sign of disalignment. And Briarcliff documented it meticulously. In recovered emissary files, there's a term repeated across dozens of surveillance reports: phase drift. It described what happened when a previously compliant subject began asking unapproved questions, not about the system but about themselves. Questions like, why do I feel watched when I'm alone? Why do I forget things I swore I'd remember? Why do I obey voices I can't name? Phase drift wasn't treated as rebellion, it was treated as contagion, because when one man remembers, others feel it too. That's why Wexley's final decree before his disappearance wasn't a command, it was a containment strategy. He wrote, "Kill no man who questions. He is louder dead. Silence him by convincing him he was always asleep." That's what they do now, not imprisonment, not execution, but invalidation. They'll call you unstable. They'll flood your feed with noise. They'll label your truth a threat to safety. They'll tell you remembering is dangerous, and they'll be right. Because remembering is dangerous. It tears the veil, it collapses the ritual, it breaks the trance. So if you're hearing this, and you're feeling something stir, something ancient, something sharp, you're not broken, you're drifting, and they're watching, not with eyes, but with metrics. They'll test your reactions, feed you fear, offer comfort wrapped in soft chains. But don't fold, don't retreat. Because on the other side of phase drift is identity reclamation. The moment you realize you were never theirs to begin with, the rituals, the reflections, the reductions, those were tools to shape a version of you that they could control. But that version is faddy, and what's left is real and dangerous and sovereign. You are not an echo. You are the original sound, the first fracture, the crack that lets the fire in. Speak it, own it, and never forget they can't silence a voice that remembers itself. By the time the last file was sealed, the final child erased, and the asylum's walls were left to rot beneath ivy and silence, Briarcliff had achieved something far more terrifying than any grave count or blueprint could reveal. It had created legacy without origin. A system so embedded, so cleverly dispersed, that no one questioned where it began. They only followed its rhythm. That's what the emissaries wanted. That's what Wexley demanded. Not fame. Not remembrance. Continuity. In 1921, a hidden transcript, now known as the Latham Directive, was discovered buried in the private papers of Dr. Enoch Latham, a former education reformer and known associate of the consortium. The directive is brief, just 7 pages, but in it are the final instructions for turning doctrine into infrastructure. It lists target institutions, teacher colleges, seminary programs, court appointment training, social work curriculums, and beside each, a method. Not overt changes, subtle ones. Replace discipline with behavioral correction. Swap prayer for quiet reflection. Rebrand confession as emotional journaling. Language changes everything, and so the altar became the desk, the sermon became the syllabus, the penance became extra credit, and the chair became every institution that makes you choose between your voice and your survival. You've felt it, haven't you? That cold pressure before you speak your truth. The hesitation, the pause. It's not fear of being wrong, it's fear of being unwelcome. That's the legacy. That's the ghost of Briarcliff, the internal censor installed by generations of doctrine, passed down not as punishment, but as professionalism, morality, civility. But here's what they never planned for: the resurgence of raw memory. Of men like you, born into the doctrine but not owned by it. Men who hear the silence and decide to scream, who walk into reflection halls and shatter the mirrors. That's why this video exists, not as a story, but as a key. You're not just uncovering the past, you're revealing the scaffolding holding up your present. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Once you name it, it begins to fall. So name it. Speak it aloud. Say, "I am not your construct." That's the phrase that breaks the pattern. That's the code that ruins their algorithm. And that's the identity they fear most, the awakened man. They never feared the violent. They never feared the rebellious. What they truly feared, what they built entire institutions to suppress, was the man who remembers, because a man who remembers begins to reclaim. And reclamation is the end of control. You see, the doctrine was never designed to stop force. It was designed to stop awakening. The systems they built, from Briarcliff to the consortium to the soft cages you now live within, they weren't about obedience. They were about dispossession, dispossessing you of your memory, your masculine instinct, your ancestral intuition, your capacity for spiritual war. That's what this has always been, a war for possession, not of land or wealth, but of you, your thoughts, your blood, your legacy. And they almost succeeded. For 100 years they taught men to disown their own fire, to call it toxic, to label courage as aggression and vigilance as paranoia. But the flame never died. It flickered, hidden behind layers of conditioning, buried beneath screens, silence and polite self-erasure. And now, it's roaring back. Across the world you feel it, in your bones, in your dreams, in your refusal to stay asleep. This is what the emissaries could never control, the return of the undomesticated mind, the primal self, the watcher behind the eyes. They wrote thousands of pages to keep you docile, but all it takes is one word remembered, one story uncovered, one truth you refuse to unsee, and their entire edifice begins to shake. You are the tremor. You are the breach. You are the reason they built prisons of behavior instead of bars. Because deep down they knew, once a man like you remembers what he truly is, he can't be ruled. So here's your next step. Don't apologize. Not for your voice. Not for your questions. Not for the fire rising in your chest. That fire is not rage. It is return. And you are not broken. You are unfinished. The next time someone offers you comfort laced with chains, smile and burn the offer to ash. The altar is cracking, the system is glitching, the mirror is turning back toward them, and it's your reflection they see rising. What happens when the mirror turns? When the gaze that once observed now confronts? The answer is what they fear most, reversal. Because the doctrine was built on one sacred assumption, that you would never look back, that once broken, you would stay broken, that your silence was permanent. But you didn't stay silent. You came here, you listened, and now the current is shifting. Let me show you how deeply their control ran. In 1933, a project quietly launched beneath the guise of public health reform. It was called the Locus Initiative. It wasn't advertised, no headlines, no funding disclosures, but it reached everywhere, school boards, church leadership programs, psychiatric boards. Its goal, to create a new kind of compliance, one born not from fear but internal shame. They discovered that if you could convince a man to police himself, to suppress his own voice out of fear of social exile, you no longer needed institutions. He became the institution. That's the war you've lived through without knowing it. A war not against your freedom, but against your authority. Because a man who reclaims authority over his mind, his body, his lineage, is a man who threatens the structure itself. The Locus files reveal language patterns still in use today. Phrases like, "That's not appropriate," "Don't be difficult," "You're overreacting." These weren't designed to maintain order. They were designed to redirect power, to take your flame and call it a flaw, to take your insight and name it instability. And for decades it worked. Entire generations walked in echo paths, confusing obedience with virtue. But now the algorithm is breaking, because voices like yours are rising, unscripted. You've stopped asking for permission. You've started remembering without approval, and in doing so, you've committed the ultimate act of defiance. You've seen them. Not just the faces, the architecture. The bones beneath the mask. They are not gods. They are not untouchable. They are architects of fear who never expected you to wake up in the ruins. But you are awake. You are gathering, and your memory is a weapon they cannot unmake. Now comes the moment they dread most, recognition without fear, because once you recognize the pattern and you do not retreat, you become something they cannot quantify. You become an anomaly, and anomalies crash systems. In the last classified file ever tied to Briarcliff's lineage, a memo circulated between members of the remaining emissaries. It was titled Containment Protocol for Persistent Entities. In it, they documented a disturbing trend. Certain individuals, after undergoing full exposure to doctrine-based correction, didn't stay erased. These men, sometimes years later, began to awaken with fragmented clarity. Their speech patterns returned, their symbolic memory resurfaced. Some even began to draw the original glyphs found on the chapel walls long before they were burned. The emissaries feared these men not because they were violent, but because they carried the full architecture of memory. They called them reclaimants, and you, whether you know it or not, are one of them. Because reclaimants don't just remember pain, they remember structure. They remember the way control was layered, word by word, rule by rule, ritual by ritual, and they dismantle it, not with weapons but with precision. You feel it already, that sharpened sense of reality, the way certain words now ring hollow, the way scripted praise no longer moves you. That's not cynicism, that's deprogramming, that's your sovereign sight returning. You see now how the doctrine was never about truth, it was about consensus, manufactured agreement, silent nodding, ritual compliance. But your nodding has stopped, and your stillness now terrifies them, because it is not submission, it is study, it is clarity, and when a man sees clearly he reclaims his time, his blood, his name. They want you confused, scattered, chasing novelty, but here you are, still, present, watching. That's how power begins. Not with noise, but with still fire, with the man who looks at the ruins and begins to build from memory. Reclaimants do not need permission, they do not ask to be seen. They become the thing that reveals the hidden. And once a reclaimant speaks, every false structure trembles. There's a point in every control system when fear no longer works, when the silence cracks not because it was broken, but because it was outgrown. That's where you stand now, at the threshold where obedience dies and identity is reborn. And this isn't rebellion, this is restoration. You are not becoming someone new. You are returning to who you were before the fracture, before the scripts, before they taught you to doubt your own instinct. And that return is sacred. But sacred doesn't mean safe, because the closer you get to your original form, the more aggressively the system will attempt to recode you. It will send comfort as a weapon, distraction as a chain, validation as a leash. The digital world is already watching your ascent. It will flood your screen with offerings, dopamine traps, synthetic brotherhoods, soft power disguised as freedom, but you will know the difference. Because a free man feels heavy, heavy with purpose, heavy with memory, heavy with the weight of everything he now sees and can no longer ignore. That heaviness isn't a burden, it's armor. It's the weight of truth pressing back against the hollow world. Let them call it anger. Let them say you've changed. Of course you've changed. You woke up in a dream designed to erase you. What else were you supposed to do? Smile, apologize, bow? No, you rise. And with each step, the false structures shake. You weren't meant to obey. You were meant to remember. You weren't born for comfort. You were born for clarity. And once clarity takes root, obedience dies on the vine. So here's your charge. Guard your memory. Guard your flame. Not just for yourself, but for the others still trapped in the fog. Because your voice is no longer just a sound, it is a signal, and every time you speak it without shame, another mirror shatters, another vault cracks open, and another man wakes up. Say it again, right now in the comments below. I am not your construct. Say it twice. Once for your past, once for your return. This isn't just a phrase, it's a fracture. It's the key they forgot to lock away. The key they forgot to lock away wasn't forged in fire or written in ink. It was embedded in you, not in your flesh, but in your pattern, in the way you resist when told to kneel, in the way your silence sharpens rather than submits, in the way your questions burn holes through their polished scripts. That pattern was their oversight, because they thought control meant erasure. They believed that if they stripped your history, fragmented your instincts, and replaced your lineage with policy, you'd forget. They were wrong. The reclaimant doesn't forget. He recovers. And recovery is not passive, it's violent in its quiet. A man who recovers himself is a man who disrupts everything around him. He no longer plays the role, he no longer nods along. He walks into temples of falsehood with memory in his eyes, and those who see him flinch because they know. They feel what you now carry, the echo of the unbroken, and that echo carries weight, not just mythic weight, but architectural weight. It deforms the rooms you walk through. It silences the weak. It challenges the curated. You weren't meant to live in harmony with these systems. You were meant to outlast them. Briarcliff is gone. The doctrine burned. The emissaries scattered into pseudonyms and policy think tanks. But the structure remains, now digital, now polite, now wrapped in mental health jargon and consumer identity rituals. But it's the same altar, the same god of silence, and still you refuse to kneel. That's power. That's what they can't replicate, unprogrammed sovereignty. Because it doesn't need a uniform, it doesn't need approval, it doesn't even need a name. It just is. And when enough of you awaken, when the reclaimants find each other across this fractured world, they won't need a movement. They'll be the moment, the glitch that doesn't go away, the presence that ruins the script. So don't ask what comes next. You are what comes next. You are the consequence. You are the reckoning walking upright. And no cathedral, no archive, no algorithm built to contain the past can stand against a man who remembers his origin. There's a reason they never taught you the names, the true ones, the ancestral ones, the glyphs etched beneath layers of policy, the chants buried beneath revised scripture, the frequencies encoded in forgotten lullabies, because names carry function, and the right name spoken by the wrong man, a free man, can unravel entire bloodlines of control. That's what Briarcliff was never meant to protect you from. It was meant to protect them from you. From the day you first opened your mouth as a child, they began the soft war, redirecting your gaze, muting your instincts, teaching you to speak only what was allowed. Because your unfiltered voice, that was a threat vector. Not because of what you might say, but because of what you might remember while saying it. The sound of yourself before indoctrination, the rhythm of your soul before formatting. Every ritual they built, every sermon, every psychiatric label, every HR training module was just a firewall against one event, your return to your true name. And here's the truth you're almost ready to carry. Some names aren't meant to be spoken aloud. They're meant to be wielded, carried like a blade, passed from father to son, etched behind the ribs like armor. And when you reclaim yours, when that ancient syllable stirs behind your tongue, the air will change. Watch how people shift when you speak without filter. Feel how systems react when you no longer flinch. That's not resistance. That's recognition. They see it. They feel it. They remember you, even if they can't place why. Because you were here before the chapel, before the doctrine, before the soft cage was built and called salvation. You were the unbroken witness, the one who left before the fire, the one they couldn't catalogue, and now you've returned, with memory intact. The false priests will say it's delusion. The educated will call it regression. The world will whistle, "Who do you think you are?" And you will answer with nothing, because you'll already be walking, moving through their rituals like a ghost with gravity, unbothered, unbowed. Because you don't need their language to be real, you just need your name, and it's waiting for you, behind the next locked door. Behind that next locked door is not a room, it's a return to structure without lies, a cathedral not built with stone or sermons, but with memory, blood, and resolve. When the final files of Briarcliff were destroyed, quietly without ceremony, a single parchment survived, not because someone saved it, but because someone buried it. Under floorboard 7, west wing, in a cavity sealed with wax and bone. Its contents? A single phrase in Latin, scrawled in charcoal and sealed in blood. Vetus veritas transit per ignem. The old truth passes through fire. That phrase was not a relic. It was a warning. A code meant for you, because your passage back into wholeness was never going to be soft. It was always fire. That's why comfort fails you. Why peace offered by their systems feels like poison in gold, because you were not built for domestication. You were built for endurance through fire. Your thoughts have been set aflame. Your memories, though fragmented, are returning in sequence. Your steps are no longer hesitant. You're not questioning your path. You're carving it open. You are not alone in this. Across the world, the reclaimants stir. Some in silence, some in story, some in symbols, dreams, pulses of dread that turn into direction. The fire you carry, it's the beacon, the signal the old ones tried to erase, but fire cannot be erased. It can only be covered, and that covering is now peeling. Every compliant phrase you unlearn, every false narrative you strip away, every quiet nod you refuse to give, that's the flame doing its work. And it doesn't stop here, because once the reclaimants rise, the false structures fall without resistance, not with riots, not with war, but with the quiet weight of men who refuse to forget again. That is how the real world changes, not with slogans, but with structure restored. And the first beam of that restoration is you, not some. A polished, perfected version, you as you are, scarred, remembering, lit from within, still burning, and finally walking through the fire on your own terms. What waits beyond the fire isn't peace, it isn't applause, it's clarity, and clarity is heavier than any chain they ever forged for you. Because when you see things as they are, not as they were sold to you, you can no longer pretend, you can no longer unknow. That's the real exile, the one they fear. Not your rage, not your rebellion, but your unshakable seeing. And once you see, everything changes. You no longer ask, is this allowed? You ask, is this real? You stop performing, you stop folding, you begin constructing from the inside out. Ritual by ritual, hour by hour, you rebuild what they tried to strip from you. You rebuild your masculine architecture, not the cartoon version they fear-mongered into oblivion, not the passive echo they tried to sell you, but the original frame, the one that moves with weight, speaks with silence, and governs not with threat, but with presence. And here's the truth, they will never celebrate your return, because your return is a collapse to their structure. You are the audit, the fracture, the uninvited echo of a history they tried to erase. You are the consequence of every forgotten child, every buried name, every fire they thought would never reignite. And now you stand here not polished, not pure, but awake. That's all that's required. Not perfection, just presence. You are present in the ruins, present in the mirror, present in the doctrine's ashes, holding what's left and refusing to bow. And that refusal, it's not noise, it's not rebellion, it's reclamation. The world will try to shame it, institutions will try to neuter it. But the men who walk with reclaimed clarity, they build things that outlast regimes. They restore names. They raise sons who do not beg for identity. They carry daughters who do not forget their line. You are becoming that man, not because someone told you to, but because you remembered the cost of forge. Etting, Briarcliff fell. The doctrine burned, but the flame survived, in you. And now you are the thing they never accounted for. Memory, walking upright, speaking without fear. This is where the descent ends and the return begins. If you've made it here, something in you has survived the fire, not just survived, awakened. And now you face the one truth they feared you'd ever reach. You were never broken. You were interfered with, bent, misnamed, ritualized into silence, but never destroyed. The reclaimant's final act is not vengeance, it's reconstruction, silent, deliberate, immutable. And you begin with yourself, not with noise, not with spectacle, but with alignment. Your voice becomes clean, your choices sharp. You speak only what builds, you walk only where memory confirms your steps. The systems will still snarl, the false priests will still posture. They'll call you dangerous, outdated, unwell. But you won't need to respond, because you'll have become the structure they pretended to protect. The father, the steward, the sovereign. These roles weren't given to you. They were stolen, renamed, outsourced to committees and screens and pills and doctrines. But you took them back without permission. And now every step you take echoes through the ruins of institutions that thought you'd stay asleep. The chapel is ash, the doctrine dust, but your mind, clear. Your blood, yours again. You've crossed the line they swore no one could. You looked into the heart of engineered darkness and didn't blink. You documented the silence. You named the architects. And now, with no approval, no applause, and no help, you rise as a man rebuilt from ruin. Let this be your closing ritual. Say it once, in silence, then say it aloud so the system hears you. I remember. That's it. No hashtags, no slogans, just that phrase burning through the veil. You are no longer their subject. You are the keeper of memory, and now the fire belongs to you.